It was a balmy morning on January 24th, 1972. The sun's golden fingers pierced through the dense canopy of Guam's jungle, bathing the lush vegetation in a soft, amber glow. Life on the island stirred as it had for centuries, birds calling from the treetops, insects humming, and the wind whispering through towering ferns. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary would unfold, a discovery that would ripple across the world. Two local farmers, Manuel Feliciano and Jesus Duenas, were making their way through the humid undergrowth, their machetes slicing through the foliage as they followed a familiar trail. These were seasoned men, well acquainted with the rhythm of the land, searching for shrimp traps they had set near a quiet stream nestled in the jungle's embrace. As they advanced, a rustling in the brush caught their attention, subtle yet deliberate. They froze. Wild pigs were common, and so were snakes. But what emerged from the shadows was neither. Standing just beyond the clearing was a thin, disheveled figure. His clothes were little more than rags stitched crudely from natural fibers, his beard long and matted, and his body gaunt from years of deprivation.
Jesus, is that a man?
The man before them raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but as a gesture of unease. His face, tanned and lined by years of hardship, held a wary expression. His eyes, sunken but intense, carried the burden of time. He spoke in broken words, a dialect unfamiliar to the farmers, yet unmistakably Japanese.
Please do not hurt me.
The farmers stood motionless, struck by the realization that this was not a lost hiker or a hermit. This was a soldier, a remnant of a war that had ended 27 years ago. His name, as they would soon learn, was Shoichi Yokoi, a sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army who had remained hidden in the jungle since World War II. The world had moved on, but Yokoi had not. To him, surrender was unthinkable, a dishonor that outweighed even death. And so for nearly 3 decades he survived in solitude, driven by duty, fear, and the unbreakable code of Bushido. Manuel and Jesus, though shocked, offered no harm. Their instincts guided them to compassion. They coaxed Yokoi out of the undergrowth with gestures and soft words, sensing that this fragile man had endured something beyond imagination. Though frail, his presence radiated resilience. By the end of the day, the authorities were notified. News of the strange discovery spread rapidly. A survivor of the Pacific War, living, breathing, and untouched by modern civilization, had emerged from history itself. Shoichi Yokoi would soon step into a world transformed, but for now, he stood as a ghost among the trees, a living echo of a distant, devastating conflict. His journey back to humanity had begun. To understand Shoichi Yokoi's decades of hidden survival, we must journey into the heart of a nation shaped by centuries of discipline, honor, and fierce loyalty. Japan's entry into World War II was not simply a military campaign. It was the manifestation of deeply ingrained cultural and ideological convictions that permeated every layer of society. From a young age, Japanese children in the 1920s and 30s were taught that their emperor, Hirohito, was divine. He was not merely a political figure, but the living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Loyalty to the emperor was absolute, superseding family, self, and even reason. In classrooms, students recited oaths pledging their lives to Japan. In homes, fathers and sons spoke with reverence about sacrifice. The concept of kokutai, or national essence, bound the individual to the will of the state, and beneath it all was the shadow of Bushido, the ancient samurai code of honor. Bushido was more than romantic tradition. During wartime, it was reshaped into a powerful tool of obedience and endurance. It emphasized loyalty, courage, and the willingness to die before surrender. Soldiers like Yokoi were not merely trained to fight, they were conditioned to believe that survival, in the absence of victory, was a shame too great to bear. Japan's military indoctrination was rigorous. Recruits endured brutal training, physical hardship, psychological manipulation, and the eradication of individual will. Questioning orders was unthinkable. Emotional expression was weakness, and capture by the enemy was the ultimate disgrace, not only to oneself, but to one's family and nation.
You will fight until your last breath. Better to die with honor than to live in shame.
By 1941, as Japan launched its campaign across the Pacific, this ideology marched with every footstep of its army. Young men like Shoichi Yokoi, loyal, disciplined, and unshakably patriotic, entered battle not expecting to return. They were weapons forged in spirit as much as in steel. When Yokoi was drafted at the age of 26, he was already molded by this mindset. He hailed from Saori, a farming town on the Nobi Plain near Nagoya, and was the youngest of 8 children. His upbringing had been humble, but his sense of duty towered. Family honor was sacred. National loyalty was unspoken law. Stationed in Guam by 1943, Yokoi was tasked with defending the island from the relentless advance of Allied forces. As bombs fell and comrades died, he held fast to his belief in eventual victory, and if not victory, then honorable death. But the war was not going in Japan's favor. In July 1944, the Battle of Guam turned catastrophic. American forces overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Many were killed. Others, including Yokoi, scattered into the jungle to avoid capture. It was not retreat, it was a final, desperate stand to preserve honor. Unknown to Yokoi, the war would end a year later. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed across a devastated Japan, announcing surrender for the first time in history. But for those hidden in Guam's vast wilderness, that message never arrived. Or if it did, it was dismissed as enemy deception. The idea that Japan could surrender was unthinkable. For Yokoi and those like him, survival meant duty, and duty meant remaining hidden, faithful, and unseen until recalled. He was not waiting for peace, he was waiting for orders. This was the world Yokoi carried with him into the jungle. A world of absolutes, a world where loyalty to the emperor was eternal, and in that world, surrender was not a choice, it was a betrayal. In the humid crucible of Guam's jungle, the air clung to the skin like a second layer, thick with the scent of decay and life intermingled. For Shoichi Yokoi and the 9 fellow soldiers who fled into its green abyss in the aftermath of the 1944 Battle of Guam, the war had not ended. It had merely changed form, from open combat to hidden resistance, from bullets to breath, from battle cries to the quiet endurance of survival. They were not deserters. In their minds, they were continuing the mission, preserving honor, evading capture, and waiting for reinforcements that would never come. Each man carried the same burden, to live invisibly, and to die before dishonor. Their early days in the jungle were a careful balance of discipline and improvisation. The group moved at night, concealing their paths with branches and covering their tracks in mud. They foraged for edible plants, fished in silence, and collected rainwater in hollowed-out bamboo shoots. Every sound could be death. Every misstep, discovery.
We must not be seen, not even by each other if the time comes. It is better that way.
Rations had long been depleted. They relied on nature, and nature gave sparingly. They learned to hunt with traps fashioned from vines and bone. Wild pigs, freshwater eels, and coconut crabs became rare delicacies. More often, they subsisted on taro roots, breadfruit, and whatever green growth could be chewed without poisoning the gut. Their clothes decayed into tatters. With needles carved from fishbone and thread from fibers stripped from tree bark, they stitched new garments, crude but serviceable. Their weapons rusted, ammunition was hoarded, never used. Fire, which might reveal their location, was forbidden. Food was eaten raw. Conversations were whispers. Still, they held to a form of military structure. Shifts were kept, watches posted, routines repeated. Their ranks had crumbled, but the discipline remained. For men forged in the fire of Imperial Japan's war doctrine, routine was a form of salvation. In routine there was order. In order, purpose. Months turned to years. Some soldiers, weakened by malaria, dysentery, or infection, slipped away into the jungle's silent embrace. One drowned during a river crossing. Another disappeared during a foraging trip and was never seen again. By 1950, 6 years after the war had ended, only 3 men remained, Yokoi and 2 others. The jungle, once a hiding place, had become their home. It was both cradle and prison. Each day they grew more distant from the outside world and more bound to the code that kept them there. Despite the odds, Yokoi adapted. He observed the behaviors of animals to locate edible plants. He discovered which mushrooms cured nausea, which leaves repelled insects, and which vines could be woven into rope. He became an artisan of survival. He built his first underground shelter, a shallow cave dug into the base of a tree, camouflaged by branches and covered in ferns. Inside, he created compartments for storage, bedding, and a trapdoor escape route. When one structure was compromised by flooding or rot, he built another. At times, they found evidence of the outside world, aircraft overhead, sounds of vehicles, even leaflets dropped from planes. Some were in Japanese, announcing that the war had ended, but the three men believed them to be enemy lies, a psychological tactic to draw them out. They trusted no one, not even the trees. By the mid-1950s, the two remaining comrades succumbed to illness. One passed from an untreated infection. The other from starvation after a dry season withered their food supply. With quiet reverence, Yokoi buried them, marked only by simple mounds covered in moss. He was now alone, and still he would not surrender. The silence of the jungle is not empty. It breathes, groans, and whispers. To the untrained ear, it's noise. But to Shoichi Yokoi, it became a language, a sacred rhythm that replaced human conversation, a pulse he came to understand better than his own heartbeat. For over 2 decades, from the mid-1950s until 1972, he lived alone, entombed in the green cathedral of Guam's wilderness. Alone, after the deaths of his last 2 comrades, Yokoi entered a new phase of survival. He mourned quietly, digging shallow graves and placing stones as silent markers. Then he returned to routine. It was his only armor against despair. His shelter, no longer shared, became his world. Hidden beneath a thick blanket of vines and loamy earth, the entrance to his cave was undetectable unless one knew precisely where to look. He chose a site beneath a large tree, using its roots to help stabilize the walls and mask the opening. The cave itself was no larger than a coffin, measuring barely 3 feet high, 4 feet across, and 6 feet long. Crawling inside required contortion and patience. Yet, within its cramped quarters, Yokoi carved a life. He wove his bedding from reeds and tree bark. He kept a small collection of salvaged tin cans for storage, some scavenged from early battlefield remains, others found at jungle edges where modernization began to nibble at the foliage. For light, he fashioned a crude lamp using oil extracted from nuts and a wick made from palm fiber. But his greatest enemy was not hunger. It was time. Time, unmarked and unchecked, became an oppressive presence. Days bled into each other, and without seasons or a calendar, Yokoi began using the moon to count months. He scratched tally marks onto the walls of his shelter, not to track days, but to remind himself he still existed. He crafted clothes from tree bark, stripping the fibers from the inner layers of trees, pounding them flat with stones, and weaving them into garments that could resist Guam's torrential rains. He was often cold, always damp, but never idle.
Keep working. If your hands move, the mind does not break.
He never built fires, not once in 27 years. The smoke might give him away. He ate everything raw: river fish, eels, snails, frogs, wild roots, bitter leaves. Insects when necessary. Hunger was constant, but starvation was managed by knowledge and precision. He became intimately familiar with every edible and inedible plant in his region. A single mistake could mean death. And yet he endured. He avoided human contact at all costs. He watched villagers from the shadows, studied their routines, and learned when it was safe to approach abandoned fields to scavenge fallen fruit. If he ever came across something man-made, a bottle, a discarded can, he took it only if absolutely necessary. He left no traces. He trusted no one. He caught glimpses of the modern world in fragments: aircraft overhead, a rusted transistor radio he dared not try to fix, a crumpled leaflet claiming the war was over. It couldn't be real. If it were, why had no one come for him? Why had he not been recalled? For Yokoi, the war had simply gone quiet. Perhaps Japan was biding its time. Perhaps new orders would come one day. Until then, he would do what he had sworn to do: survive, remain hidden, and never surrender. Yet even iron cracks in silence. At times, Yokoi wept, not loudly, but with shuddering restraint. He dreamed of his mother, of childhood rice fields, of temples during New Year. He pressed his palm to his chest and reminded himself that pain was proof of duty. What kept him going? Not delusion, not madness, but discipline, pride, and the deep, unshakable belief that sacrifice was his purpose. As the years passed and the jungle changed, paths turned to roads, villages crept closer. Yokoi remained a whisper among the trees, a phantom of a war that had long since ended for everyone but him. It was just past dawn on January 24th, 1972. The jungle, as always, was thick with dew and buzzing with life. To the local farmers Manuel Feliciano and Jesus Duenas, it was a morning like any other. They had set out early to check their shrimp traps near the Talafofo River, their machetes swinging at their sides, boots pressing into the soft, damp soil. They had walked this path countless times before, knew every bend and thorn. But this time, something changed. A rustle in the undergrowth. Not the scurry of a lizard or the breeze on a leaf, but something deliberate. Heavy, watching.
Manuel, you hear that?
They paused, their eyes scanning the thickets. From the shadows, a figure emerged, slowly, cautiously, like a memory materializing from the earth itself. The man was painfully thin, his cheekbones protruding beneath leathery skin, his eyes deep-set, alert and afraid. His clothes were crude, woven from bark and vines. His hair was long, knotted, wild. His hands trembled, yet he stood tall. Shoichi Yokoi.
Please do not shoot me.
The words were Japanese, spoken softly, hesitantly, as if torn from a dream. He held no weapon, only the posture of a man who had spent a lifetime watching shadows. The farmers froze, stunned. This man, he looked like he had walked out of a history book, like he didn't belong.
Who are you?
Yokoi's eyes flicked between them. His instincts screamed to run, but something deeper held him in place, a weariness, a realization, perhaps even a sliver of hope. He raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. The jungle fell into silence. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if nature itself was bearing witness to the reunion of past and present. The farmers, cautious but moved by compassion, approached slowly. They didn't understand his language, but they saw his condition, starved, exhausted, dignified. He was no threat, just a man lost in time.
It's okay, you're safe now.
Yokoi nodded faintly, lowering his eyes. He didn't understand the words, but the tone, the kindness, broke something open inside him. For nearly 3 decades he had hidden from humanity. Now humanity was reaching back. They led him out of the jungle, not forcefully, but as companions. Step by step, he left behind the trees, the earth cave, the handmade tools, and solitude. He carried nothing but a small satchel and his memories. It wasn't surrender, it was return. As they reached the village, word spread like wildfire. Authorities arrived, translators, journalists, photographers. But in those first few moments, Yokoi said little. He bowed often, politely, and repeated a phrase that would echo around the world in the coming days.
It is with much embarrassment that I return.
That single sentence captured decades of silence, sacrifice, and the unshakable sense of duty that had shaped every moment of his life in the jungle. To him, survival was not triumph, it was shame. He had lived to serve. To return without orders felt like failure. But to the world, Shoichi Yokoi was no failure. He was a symbol of devotion, of resilience, of a forgotten chapter suddenly made flesh. The jungle had preserved a relic of the past, and now the past was walking back into history, one step at a time. Shoichi Yokoi had emerged from the jungle, but the journey was far from over. As the farmers led him away from the trees that had sheltered him for 27 years, each step felt heavier than the last. The world beyond the vines and branches roared with color, noise, and life. Civilization, a concept he had buried with his fallen comrades, now surged around him, unapologetic and unfamiliar. He did not run, nor did he speak much, but his eyes moved constantly, taking in sights that had no place in the world he remembered. Metal vehicles, clothing made of materials he had never touched, electric lights, cameras flashing like bursts of lightning, people not in uniform, but in shirts and dresses, laughing, staring, reaching toward him as if he were a miracle.
They look so different.
By the time they reached the edge of Talafofo village, Guam's authorities had been alerted. Military personnel and doctors arrived quickly, their approach careful and respectful. A translator was found, one who spoke Japanese, and he gently introduced himself.
Sergeant Yokoi, you are safe now. The war is over. Japan surrendered in 1945. You have survived.
Yokoi listened in stunned silence. His hands gripped the edges of his bark-woven satchel, his posture still disciplined, still rigid. But behind his eyes storms brewed, of confusion, grief, disbelief.
Surrender? No, that cannot be, not Japan.
He was transported in a military vehicle, his first ride in a machine since the 1940s. The metal seat beneath him vibrated with every bump on the road. Trees rushed past the windows. He sat upright, arms folded, eyes wide. Everything was too fast, too loud, too bright. When they arrived at Guam Memorial Hospital, Yokoi was greeted by white-coated doctors and nurses whose curiosity was tempered by compassion. They didn't rush him. They didn't question. They simply guided him into a room and began gently tending to his body, a frame reduced to sinew and bone, sustained by will alone.
We'll take care of you, sir. Just rest now.
For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Yokoi lay on a bed, a real bed. The mattress beneath him was soft, too soft. It made him feel vulnerable, exposed. He missed the hard earth, the cold roots, the smell of moss and rain. They cleaned his wounds, took blood samples, administered vitamins. He barely understood the procedures, but he did not resist. He had given himself up to the world now. Let it do what it would. The hospital cafeteria brought food, warm rice, miso soup, grilled fish, familiar dishes made by strangers. Yokoi wept silently as he ate, each bite a reminder of the years he had spent gnawing on raw roots and chewing jungle leaves. It wasn't just food, it was memory. During the night, a nurse found him sitting on the floor beside his bed, his back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest.
Sergeant, why not sleep in the bed?
The ground feels more honest.
Word of his discovery spread beyond Guam. Journalists from Japan and around the world flooded the island. Photographers camped outside the hospital. Letters arrived by the dozens. But inside the quiet room on the 2nd floor, Shoichi Yokoi said very little. He was not yet ready to speak. He had crossed a chasm, not just of space, but of time. And the man who had lived beneath roots and shadows was only beginning to confront the world that had forgotten him. On February 2nd, 1972, just days after his discovery, Shoichi Yokoi boarded an aircraft bound for his homeland. It was his first time aboard a plane. As the engines roared to life, he sat motionless, hands resting on his lap, head bowed. A military escort sat beside him, translating gentle instructions. But Yokoi barely noticed the words. His thoughts were in Saori, his childhood village, and with the family he hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. The journey from Guam to Japan took hours, but for Yokoi, it felt like a single heartbeat stretching across decades. He pressed his face against the window, watching clouds drift below like ghostly rivers. Somewhere beneath them lay a country he no longer knew. When the aircraft touched down at Haneda Airport in Tokyo, a swell of reporters, government officials, and curious citizens awaited. Camera flashes erupted as the hatch opened. The crowd surged forward, eager to glimpse the man who had lived through history itself. Yokoi appeared at the top of the stairs in a neatly pressed brown suit provided by the hospital. His shoes were polished, his beard trimmed, but his eyes, dark, wary, humbled, carried the jungle with them. As he descended the steps, the crowd grew quiet. A hush fell over the runway. It was not just spectacle, it was reverence, and grief, and awe.
So much has changed, and yet I still belong to the past.
He was met by government officials and representatives of the Imperial Household Agency. They bowed respectfully. No one dared ask him to speak yet. But then, from the crowd, a soft cry pierced the silence. His elder sister pushed through the barriers, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had long believed her brother to be dead, swallowed by war. Now, she stood before him, trembling.
Brother, is it really you?
Yokoi's expression wavered. His posture, so rigid, so disciplined, softened. He took a slow step forward, then another. Finally, he embraced her. His body shook, not from cold or illness, but from the sudden, jarring warmth of human connection.
I have caused you so much pain, I am sorry.
The moment was broadcast across Japan. Millions watched, breath held, as a man thought long dead returned not as a ghost, but as a living symbol of honor and endurance. For a nation that had endured war, defeat, and resurrection, Yokoi became something more than a soldier. He was a thread pulled from the past, now woven into the fabric of a new era. Yet as they drove through Tokyo's neon-lit streets, Yokoi remained quiet. Billboards flashed in English. Elevated trains rumbled overhead. Pedestrians bustled in miniskirts and western suits. The skyline had exploded with steel and ambition.
This is not the Japan I left.
To the people around him, he was a hero. But to himself, he was a relic. He had not fought in the post-war struggle. He had not rebuilt cities or studied new technologies. He had been absent, and that absence now weighed heavily on his sense of belonging. He was taken to a modest hotel and shielded from the media frenzy for several days. During that time, he reunited with nieces, nephews, and distant cousins, some of whom had been born long after he vanished. One young woman in particular, his niece Kazuko, showed him photos of the family, explained how television worked, and introduced him to a strange new device called a microwave.
You'll get used to all this, Uncle, one step at a time.
Yokoi nodded, though inwardly he wasn't sure. His soul was still wrapped in vines and bark cloth. The jungle had shaped him. Now he had to reshape himself. The banners had been taken down, the cameras packed away, the headlines faded. And in the quiet that followed Shoichi Yokoi's return, the real work began, learning to live in a Japan transformed by time, technology, and peace. He moved into a modest home near Nagoya, not far from the village of Saori where he was born. But it was not the village he remembered. Fields had become factories, thatched rooftops had yielded to steel and concrete. Children no longer bowed in the streets. They rode bicycles, carried transistor radios, and studied English in school. For weeks, Yokoi woke each morning before sunrise, instinctively gathering his tools, only to realize there was no trap to check, no vines to weave, no silence to guard. The routine that had preserved him now left him aimless.
How does one become a man again in a world without orders?
He struggled with everyday tasks. Elevators startled him. He refused to use electric appliances. He bathed with a bucket, cooked his rice on a charcoal flame, and trimmed his nails with a knife he had carried from the jungle. Technology overwhelmed him, but he never asked for pity. He preferred discomfort to dependence. And yet, despite the weight of change, Yokoi did not retreat. He observed, he listened, and gradually, he adapted. One of his first decisions was to return to an old craft, tailoring. Before the war, he had learned the fundamentals of mending clothes from a village seamstress. During his jungle years, he had survived by weaving cloth from tree bark and stitching it with thorn and vine. Now, with thread and fabric at his fingertips once more, he found something sacred in the act. He apprenticed quietly at a local tailor shop, refusing special treatment. His hands, calloused and precise, moved with patience. He mended hems, fitted jackets, restored frayed cuffs. Customers were amazed by his skill and humbled by his humility.
You're a master of detail. Every stitch carries care.
I only do what must be done, one thread at a time.
But reintegration was not only a matter of labor, it was emotional. Yokoi became a national figure, invited to appear on television, to speak at universities, to write essays on honor and perseverance. He accepted few invitations. When he did speak, he chose his words carefully.
You must learn from the past, not to repeat it, but to understand it. What I endured was not greatness, it was duty.
Some hailed him as a hero. Others saw him as a tragic figure, an emblem of a time when ideology demanded blind devotion. A few questioned why he hadn't surrendered, even when survival was near impossible. But Yokoi never boasted. He carried no bitterness, only reflection. To him, his return was not a triumph, but a second chance, a chance to live, contribute, and witness peace. His niece Kazuko became his closest companion, teaching him how to use a telephone, how to read a newspaper again, how to navigate a world that no longer measured honor by sacrifice, but by compassion.
Uncle, it's okay to be happy. You don't have to apologize for living.
I am learning, but the jungle still lives here.
He tapped his chest, not with sorrow, but with reverence. In time, Yokoi became a bridge between generations, between history and modernity. He appeared in schoolbooks, documentaries, even comic strips, yet he remained deeply private. He never owned a television, never traveled far from home. He found his peace not in fame, but in simplicity. In the quiet corner of his home, he kept a small shrine, not to the emperor, not to the war, but to his fallen comrades. He placed incense each morning and offered silent prayers, words the world would never hear. The years passed softly, like wind over a still pond. Shoichi Yokoi, once a ghost of the jungle and then a reluctant national figure, chose to live the rest of his life in dignity and quiet rhythm. He asked for no honors. He refused large payments for interviews. And though the world still spoke his name, he let his days unfold in peace. He rose early each morning and walked the streets of his neighborhood in Nagoya. People would recognize him. Children bowed. Adults smiled. He always returned their greetings with a polite nod and little more. He was not chasing the world. He had seen enough of it in silence. He maintained his simple habits. He preferred hand-drawn baths to modern plumbing. He often cooked over charcoal. He sewed his own clothes, even when offered designer suits. These choices were not stubbornness, but gratitude. Everything modern was a gift, yet the jungle had taught him not to take life for granted. In rare moments of public speaking, he spoke not of war stories, but of peace.
The war taught us obedience, yes, but we must teach the next generation wisdom. There is no honor in blind sacrifice, there is only sorrow.
He visited war memorials with a bowed head and quiet tears. When asked if he had hated the enemy, he would shake his head gently.
No man who has lived alone for 27 years has room for hate, only memory.
He published a short memoir, written with the help of Kazuko and a local writer. In it, he detailed his survival methods, his thoughts during his jungle years, and his hope that Japan would never again walk the road to war. The book became a bestseller, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deeply human. Visitors from around the world wrote to him, survivors of conflict, prisoners of war, refugees. They thanked him not for his war, but for his endurance, for reminding them that the human spirit, even in silence, can prevail. Yokoi's health declined gradually. He suffered from high blood pressure and kidney issues, likely made worse by decades of malnutrition. But he never complained. When asked by doctors about his pain, he would simply smile and say,
"I have lived, that is enough."
On September 22, 1997, Shoichi Yokoi passed away at the age of 82. His funeral was attended by hundreds, family, journalists, former soldiers, schoolchildren. The emperor sent a letter of condolence. So did the president of Guam. He was buried in a small ceremony, just as he had requested. No fanfare, no marching bands, just incense, soft prayers, and the quiet weeping of a nation who had, in him, rediscovered a part of its soul. In years that followed, his story became a permanent part of Japanese education. His underground cave in Guam was reconstructed as a historical exhibit. His name entered textbooks, museums, even novels. But perhaps the most profound legacy was one etched in the hearts of those who had once felt forgotten or alone. Yokoi's tale was not just about war. It was about will. It was about the unyielding ember that burns within us when all else fades. The ability to endure, to find meaning even in hardship, to choose dignity over despair. He once said that nature was his teacher, that the jungle, for all its cruelty, showed him the strength of simplicity. In his solitude, he had not just survived, he had learned what it meant to be human.
If I am remembered at all, let it be not as a soldier, but as a man who kept going.
And so he is. A lantern in the wind. A figure carved not from myth, but from the raw truth of survival. A man who walked out of the past with nothing but honor in his heart and gave the world a story it will never forget. The end.